One of the best shows I ever had was not in this part of the world at all. It was in Baghdad. One of the country western guys, he was on stage and the lights went out and the sound went out all at once. It was like 2,000 soldiers standing, and it was cold. And they're all just standing there in their, in their camos, just, waiting. And all of a sudden there's no show. And they said it would take an hour to fix the generator or half an hour or something like that. So I said, I'll go on because I don't need a guitar, I don't need electricity. The thing that hit me was that the guy, I was standing with this guy, Sergeant White, and he said, he looked at the soldiers and he said, if this was Madison Square Garden, they would be yelling and throwing stuff and wanting their money back. But these guys were just standing there, just waiting. It just broke my heart, So I just went on stage, and they were it's the best audience I ever had. They weren't like an audience of American consumers that are like, well, I wanted to see a show. It's for me. Then they leave and they go, I wasn't crazy about the first. Didn't really work. Just the way we are now. And then they'd write a blog the next day. Subpar show, not really great. That kind of thing. These guys are like, this guy doesn't have a mic. He needs us. And so everyone that was there noticed this. They all crushed in. They all pushed in to each other's backs to get closer to me, and every joke they would laugh way harder than the joke was funny. And I was filthy. That's the dirtiest show I ever did, and I think it stands out to me as one of the best shows I ever did.
Now, you performed in Afghanistan, and actually it was a tour of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Kuwait. Did I get that right?
That's right.
And
that's right.
In season 2 of Louie, you actually go to Afghanistan to perform. So let's talk about real life first. Why did you want to do a USO tour?
Well, it started for me because I went to Washington, D.C. on a USO sort of little tour with Pamela Adlon, who played my wife on Lucky Louie, and she works on my series Louie as a consulting producer and sometimes writer. She does
performs in it as well.
Yeah, she's also played as my my unrequited love on the first 2 seasons. She is a voice actress, and there was a group of voice actors, like people that do cartoons and stuff, who went to D.C. To do hospital visits at Walter Reed, which isn't there anymore, and Bethesda, and a few other USO type things around Christmas time. This is a few years ago, and so they invited me to come and do a stand-up comedy portion. So I came and I did stand-up in some Army and Navy-based cafeterias, basically, and visited a bunch of wounded warriors in their hospital rooms. And this was something I'll never forget, because these were guys who had been terribly injured, like maybe 2 days before, and here they are in a hospital room back home, and I'm in their room, and I didn't know what the hell I would have to offer them. But basically, the doctor goes in first and says, do you want USO? Do you want to visit? And they always say yes. And you come in, and this soldier whose face is totally disfigured, like freshly, like cotton in the eye socket where the eye should be, like just a cotton ball. And their arm is just destroyed and no leg or whatever. And they're sort of sitting up in the bed with this smile, and they're hosting you in their room. They're like, welcome.
Did you do comedy there?
Yeah, I did comedy like in the cafeteria of the hospital. I did comedy in the naval base chow lounge and stuff like that.
Well, let me ask you this. A lot of your comedy is about sex. And, whether it's one-on-one or with another person. Yeah. And, a lot of the wounded veterans have injuries that will temporarily or permanently affect their sexual lives or ruin their sexual lives. So did that make your sex jokes off limits? And sex jokes, that's something that ordinarily that you could really have in common with soldiers, jokes about sex.
Well, it's interesting because when you do USO, this is the first time I had done it. The last thing they want is for you to mess around and say anything controversial, sexually or otherwise. And so they just ask you, please just make it simple and please just keep it polite, because they just don't want any trouble. But here's what always happens. You find yourself in front of a bunch of wounded veterans, and they just want to have fun. And they don't want to hear polite comedy. They want to hear you go crazy. And so every time I did these shows, I would start polite, and then I would maybe test the waters with one something dirty, and they'd go crazy. And I'm looking at a bunch of guys who want relief, and they want to laugh. And listen, if you just had an IED take away part of your sex life, I think laughing about sex is actually a relief for you. These guys laughed so hard at the sex jokes that I just got dirtier and dirtier. And then I got offered to go on the Sergeant Major of the Army's tour in Iraq and Kuwait and Afghanistan. So I jumped at it because of the experience that I'd had in D.C. And over there, it was the same. There was sort of like this, I would be told by a battery of people to keep it clean, keep it clean. And then I'd go on stage and the soldiers would beg me to get dirty, and I would get really dirty. And then I'd come off stage and apologize. And then I started to realize that that's what they all wanted me to do, including the people telling me to keep it clean. They tell me to keep it clean, I get dirty, I apologize. That just became the process. That way the soldiers can have a good time without the Army endorsing it. You know what I mean? They
have deniability.
Yes, the Sergeant Major would stomp around. I can't believe you said these things. And I go, I'm so sorry, Sergeant Major. I mean, what do I care? I'm not in the Army. What's he going to do? Demote me to when I was 15? You can't hurt me. Send me home from Iraq? What a bummer, So, and there was one night, actually, because the Sergeant Major of the Army, he's like the guy, he's the main, I don't know, I'm going to explain what he is, but he's a very important guy in the Pentagon, and he took us on the tour. And he was a little pissed off at me for being dirty over there. But there was one night in Baghdad where we were doing a show for 2,000 soldiers, all just standing in gravel, and it was cold. I didn't know it gets cold in Baghdad. And there was country western bands. That was most of the show, and I was just this comedian break in the middle of it. So the first country western band was on stage, and the lights went out, and the sound went out. That somebody didn't fill the generator, so there was just suddenly no show. And it would take an hour to fill it with gas and start it again. So I said, I'll go out there because I can yell. I don't need a guitar. So I stood on the lip of the stage and in the dark in front of 2,000 people in Baghdad, and I just yelled my act. And it was one of the most profound experiences I've ever had as a comedian because the audience, they weren't an audience like at home. A regular audience would have thrown bottles at me. But these people rallied for me, and they were dead quiet when I was speaking, and then they cheered like crazy for every joke, whether they found it funny or not, I think. Oh. And I did a full hour to this audience of soldiers. And because I was yelling, I had to be really coarse and rude. There's no subtlety to that kind of comedy. And it was one of the most amazing hours of comedy I've done in 26 years of whatever it's been. And when I came off, the Sergeant Major was standing right there, and he shook my hand and said, "You done good." And, this is a real kind of Army moment.
So in season